Okay, enough. I need to mix that in the beginning of my calls. Hello. I was tired of the whole, I felt like I screamed, hi there, in the beginning of the past audio. So today, I think a little bit more Ipanema or something Coastas de Ipanema. How do you guys enjoy that? A little bit, right? Okay, 30 seconds in, we're ready. So today, a bit more playful today, of course. Linking a little bit from my last audio to this audio, we're still in the Ontology of Epistemic Production, Ontology of Knowledge Production, which is the ontology chapter of my thesis. And what I did, I had a first draft. It was a bit messy because I had still a lot of my notes and so on, but I submitted that. Now I went back to that chapter and I wrote down what are the topics that I'm speaking about throughout the entire chapter. So this is what we're going to discuss today. So this is the structure of the chapter, right? What is contained in this. Now remember, the title of the chapter is Ontology of Epistemic Production. And the reason I'm doing this, and I will eventually talk about it, it's important to start from somewhere, and Rosie Braidotti, I don't know how to pronounce her name, the Italian philosopher, she gave a Harvard lecture, which is so amazing. I feel so enthusiastic about her lecture. I will probably link that in the description. Braidotti's lecture. I think it was in 2017. And she says, listen, you need, in the new condition, in the new convergence that we're living in, of posthumanism, you need to start from somewhere. You need to ground your discourse, ground your narrative, have some level of perspectivism. And this is what the chapter introduces. It introduces the perspective from which I am speaking about the systems of knowledge production. And this is what it introduces. So, first, I will talk about an onto-epistemological shift of the 20th century, give a brief introduction of what is epistemology and how I deal with the question. For example, Husserl speaks of the conditions of knowledge in consciousness. Foucault introduced this sort of shift in epistemological culture from the 17th to the 19th century, up to the 20th century, from classical philosophy to enlightenment. So the man of reason, man became not only the subject of knowledge, but knowledge itself. So then we saw the rise of the human sciences. And now I'm introducing this sort of like a third leap into what Foucault talks about, which is the leap that is happening in the 20th century. And I'm speaking that now is no longer the man. Foucault already introduced that man was something that was going to fade away, just like the waters in the seashore. And what I'm saying is now the focus is in the same way that Husserl introduced the epistemological question in the conditions of epistemological agency in consciousness, Foucault in man, human. Now I say, well, now from the 20th century to the 21st century, these conditions are in the social material structures. This means, of course, technological systems. social technical systems, social material structures, not only the infrastructure of knowledge production, which would be the material conditions. You need networks, you need computing devices, and so on. But these social interactions that make all that emerge from the lower level interactions. And this is the new condition of knowledge in the post-human condition. This introduces a shift in epistemic agency. So now that human is no longer the condition of knowing, but the social material structure, then there is a shift in epistemic agency from the individual mind to the collective social technical apparatus. And this shift is described in STS. So I use the work of Cetina, particularly her book Epistemic, it's Karen Cetina. She wrote this book called Epistemic Cultures, How the Sciences Produce Knowledge, and there she describes the shift of agency from the individual scientist to the collective social material structure of the laboratory. Then Andrew Pickering, another STS scholar, is a British sociologist. He introduced the problem of agency. He says, well, agency is now the sort of interactive phenomenon, and whatever needs to be produced is going to, knowledge in the laboratory, for instance, is going to emerge from the interaction of the agents. So agency arises from the interaction, not from the individual agent. And then Bruno Latour transformed that into a collective framework by through his ANT, which is the actor network theory. He says, well, this is all happening because several actors spread across networks are interacting, and knowledge emerges from this mesh of interaction. Interactive mesh, like I'd say like that. But this is the STS foundation for why epistemic agency now emerges from the social technical, social material structure. But then I say, well, this actually has a little bit of an origin in process philosophy of the early 20th century, with cybernetic systems, Whitehead, interactionism. He's saying, well, the nature of things is that everything is interconnected. And this is heavily reflected in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, who say that now we have this collective assemblage that is enacting knowledge and so on. Bear in mind that I still need to rearrange certain things. Actually, I introduced the problem of Foucault's archaeology of knowledge and how there's a shift in epistemic agency after this. But now I'm thinking I should move this to the beginning, just like I mentioned in the audio. But in my notes, in the chapter, it appears now, but this is something that needs to be shifted. So, well, this is a sort of a third step into Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, that now beyond men, now the conditions of knowledge is the social material structure. And then what comes next is the problem of ontological multiplicity. And I don't know how I am linking these two, but also ontological multiplicity should probably come first of anything at all. And I think that the reason it appeared now as I was writing is because once I engaged with STS thinkers, then automatically it led me to speak of ontological multiplicity, because in the STS discipline, first you had the problem of the social construction of technology. And then as the discipline evolved, then Anne-Marie Moll, I think it was in early 2000s, she published her ethnography of medical practice, introducing the problem of ontological multiplicity. And then comes Donna Haraway. It also combines with the question of perspectivism. And they all say, listen, now we had this idea that reality is objective, it's out there, and we all observe the same reality. When what STS does, it says, no, on the contrary, we're all observing different versions. Our observation become different versions of reality. So in medical practice, for instance, in the work of Anne-Marie Moll, the disease that's being diagnosed and treated within the practice, it becomes a different kind of thing as the patient navigates through the different specialties that are needed to deal with the problem collectively. So in each instance of the treatment of the process, of the medical process, the observation is a specific thing. They're not all making the same observation about reality. They're all making different observations. And this became this thing about ontological multiplicity, which was picked up by John Law, working with Vic Singleton, them both in Lancaster University. And they're saying they actually reinforced the notion of ontological multiplicity and said, well, these are different realities. The world is multiple, reality is multiple, and every agent is coming up with their own version of reality. And this is why having the ontology of epistemic production as the first chapter in the book is important, because it's not only that I am following Braidotti's suggestion that you need to start from somewhere. You need to start the conversation from somewhere, and you need to lay it out. You need to frame the discussion. But it's also introducing the problem that it's one ontology in the multiple ontologies that observations become. This is why the introduction of ontology here is needed. Then we move to the question of so this is all of the ontology, the ontological and epistemological shift of the 20th century that says, now we have a different intellectual landscape to work with. It's a different epistemic culture. Agency, epistemic agency has shifted from the individual to the collective. And now this is what we have to deal with. And as it is introduced by Deleuze and Guattari, it becomes this collective assemblage of things. And that is the apparatus of knowledge production. The knowledge is now produced in the collective of agents, the sociological processes, and the material structures that are involved in the knowledge production process. And this agency is now an emergent property of the collective assemblage. As Pickering says, agency arises in the interaction. So you have the lower level, and this is very systems thinking, although I'll only speak about systems a little later in the chapter, in the next session. It's already important to understand the concept of emergence. Emergence is a phenomenon that appears, some kind of novelty that appears from the interaction of lower level agents in the system, lower level elements. In systems thinking, you have levels of system. It's an open system, and as the lower level, if you go down to if you deconstruct something, you go down to the individual elements that give form to it. The interaction of those individual forms gives rise to something bigger than the collective of the individual forms, and that's a higher level of complexity of the system. So if you think of a community, the individual humans interacting, what arises from their interaction is a community. So a community is a higher level of the social system from that lower level interaction, which is the lower level being the individual humans. So agency now is an emergent property from these lower level interactions. So human agents, technical agents, and the processes in which they engage and interact gives rise to agency as emergence, as an emergent property. So from this, because agency emerges from the lower level interaction, now it shifts to a distributed agency, and whatever emerges, so knowledge, because it's what we're treating with, shifts to the distributed network. And this is a lot due to the material transformations that we lived throughout the 20th century. So particularly cybernetics, because it sort of proliferated information and communication technology. It developed the theoretical groundwork, the knowledge that was needed to allow for information to transit through material substrates, different material substrates. So it became the information and communication technology, the information theory that was developed during the cybernetics project, 1940s, 50s, and 60s, was adopted by the industry, and that helped proliferate information and communication technology, and that caused an intense material transformation in the world. And a lot of the shift of epistemic agency is conditional, is a consequence of that material transformation. Now, understanding all of this that we talked about, the ontology, the shift in epistemic agency, and the sort of condition shifting from the individual to the collective apparatus, helps us move from the ontological claim to say what is that the perspective that we're speaking from, to the concrete practice, to the analysis of concrete practice, because now we have the foundation, now we have the groundwork. This is the perspective that we're starting from, and with this perspective, this is how we move into the analysis of technological systems, socio-technical infrastructures. Now, social-technical systems is what I speak about next. Now we move into the social-technical systems, and we're going to introduce, again, the early beginnings of STS, which is Science and Technology Studies. The Science and Technology Studies, they began because knowledge in science, specifically scientific knowledge, became sort of a political asset, particularly during the Cold War years. Scientists were being hired by the government to create weapons, for warfare more intensely. So during the First World War, Second World War, but that became quite evident during the Cold War era. So sociologists began to question the methods of technology production. What was it about technology that had become so important? And as they entered the science, so sociologists were very distant from science until then, from the actual field of scientific practice of technological development. But then sociologists began entering the field of technology production and began employing the sociological methods of observation, interviews, and ethnographic methods, and began to understand the culture of technology production through a sociological lens. And they began to argue that technology is it's socially produced. So again, with that question of agency, what is produced is only produced through the interaction. So it involves the material elements in the laboratory. So for example, in the molecular biology laboratory, you can only do science because you have the material elements of the laboratory to help you process the chemicals that you need to process, to measure, and to analyze. And that knowledge, so that scientific knowledge, is only produced because the material structure is there. So the material is inherently part of the knowledge production process, and that knowledge only comes into being because there is an interaction between the scientist with the material element. So this became the sort of idea that technology is socially constructed. This was the early beginnings of STS. And a second question came as to how the social shaping of technology, which is what I just described, also shapes the social dynamics in return. Now, this is an important point here for this for this ontology that I'm speaking about, the ontology of epistemic practice, because this introduces the problem of mutual regulation. So humans regulate technology in the making process of technology. Their agency is regulatory. They remove some elements of the technology, or they limit some measurements and so on. That's all a form of regulation. But then in the same way that technology is being regulated by the agency that humans is imposing on it, then the other way around happens as well. And this is very evident in computational systems. The very fact that we have, for instance, a computational device on the desk with a keyboard, this all creates a situation in which the human needs to have its arms in a certain way. It needs to be sitting in a chair or standing. It needs to be looking at the monitor. So the way that the technology is shaped will shape human behavior in return. And this introduces the question of regulation in social technical systems, because then you see the regulation happens in that interaction. And the central argument in the thesis is that social technical behavior is regulated at the level of interface. But I don't want to be jumping too fast, because this chapter is still talking about the ontology of this. So this really say, okay, if the social shaping of technology shapes social dynamics in return, this it introduces some form of political agency. So technology embodies some form of political power in itself. This was an argument made in 1980s by Langdon Winner. The Technology Has Politics. He has an excellent book called Techniques Out of Control. It's about autonomous technology, autonomous systems, autonomous technology as a theme in political thought. Excellent work. And he introduces this problem as saying there is a mutually regulating phenomenon happening there with the interactions of between humans and technology. Now, this is another point that I might need to reorganize, because then I get a bit of an introduction between a difference between social technical systems and social technical infrastructure. So the infrastructure is the material condition, where a social technical system involves the sociological processes. And then because they are systems of information, they are epistemic systems. So here I'm justifying why I call them epistemic systems. Social technical systems, I call them epistemic systems. And in that, because they are systems of information, they produce knowledge, they become epistemic systems. Then the knowledge production in my work is in this ontology that I'm introducing is introduced as excuse me, as the behavior of the social technical system. So now that we know that knowledge production is the behavior of social technical systems, we need to understand how that behavior happens and how it's regulated. I introduced a bit of a quote into the question of human-machine system from Deleuze and Guattari. These are indivisible configurations. This is also what is actually discussed in cybernetics, in early cybernetics. Early cybernetics was always about human in the loop. If you read the work of Norbert Wiener, who is considered the father of cybernetics, his science was about the question of control in humans and machines. So when he's speaking about I believe is this propulsion mechanism in a ship, in a battleship or something like that, he's speaking about the regulation with the human always in the loop of that regulatory process. When he's speaking about the what is it, a fighter, an arm, speaking about the shooting device in a fighter jet, I believe. It's the question of the human being able to control the direction and the pressure and so on. So human was always in the loop in early cybernetics. So human-machine systems are indivisible configurations. And the reason they are connected is that they are indivisible is something that I call transduction mechanism. This is also a term used in cybernetics, but humans process information in their biological brain, but inside the biological brain is electrical frequencies that are traveling through the neural networks within the brain. Then they come towards the environment. They are released towards the environment as some form of frequency. So the audio, the voice that I'm speaking is an electrical frequency that the computing device, the recording device, is capturing. And then it's translating into a form of electrical pulses, so 0101, that the machine can understand. In this process, So when I look at a monitor and I see the image of a monitor, there are lots of electrical frequencies that are happening in different ways that I can, that my visual perception system can capture those frequencies. And because of my memory system, my biological memory system, because I've learned throughout life that green is green, blue is blue, red and red, and certain letters mean certain things, and certain combination of letters means certain things, then I can capture that from my environment and make sense. And this interaction is what the feedback loop is. I have to write it down here because I'm not sure I'm explaining this in detail. Feedback loop. And the feedback loop is the regulatory mechanism between the social environment and the technical system. And this interaction is what regulates the social-technical behavior. This is the key of the argument in the thesis again. Now, this could be argued as if you're saying that social-technical system is this one thing, introducing this difference, machine and human, can still be a dualistic sort of ontology, not the ontology that you're presenting. But Niklas Luhmann speaks this quite well. He says, in systems, the question of boundaries, so the dualistic boundaries that are established, is important because feminist technoscience, in particular posthumanism, is sort of breaking down these boundaries, right? Humans and machines don't have boundaries. Human nature don't have boundaries. The breakdown of boundaries is important ontologically for us to understand that humans and machines, they work, and something from it becomes, from that interaction gives rise, the interaction gives rise to a higher level system. So it's one system. Human nature, there's no division, we're nature as well. So feminist technosciences and post-human philosophies trying to break down those boundaries, but this is only ontologically. What Niklas Luhmann does, and what I reinforce, is the question of boundaries becomes a methodological tool for analysis. Because, and this is where Niklas Luhmann helps here, is he says, because boundaries reduce complexity. Because when you don't have boundaries, you don't know what you're analyzing. It's too complex. But if you start establishing boundaries between things, elements in the system, then you can observe at the level of boundary, at this space of boundary, what kinds of interactions happen there. And you can differentiate one thing from another. So it's actually boundaries and the sort of dualisms is a bit of a methodological tool for analysis. And this is where it helps. But of course, ontologically, posthumanism and feminist technoscience is breaking that down just to remind us human is nature, human and machine it can be a single system and can be seen as a single system, and so on. I think I'm going to stop here because this is very long and I feel like I'm already breaking down a little. How much more do I have? Yeah, I still have about half of the chapter to talk about, but I think this is good enough for now. The next sessions that I speak about is distributed cognition, because then I already arrived at the problem of, okay, it's a single system, it's a social technical system. It's a system that produces knowledge, so this is why I call it epistemic system. And regulation happens at the level of interaction, at the boundary, through feedback loops. I think these are the core elements of the argument, anyhow. And then in the next, I'll speak about What continues is a bit more detail about distributed cognition, which is the sort of behavioral function of the epistemic system. And this is the last, like, sort of technical aspect of the ontology. But then I closed the chapter, the last session in the chapter section in the chapter is about the post-human condition. And it's going to say, well, why did I say all of this? Why did I introduce all of these innovative concepts to epistemic practice? And the reason is because we're living in a new philosophical era, the 20th century. Cybernetics and all of the material transformations that were the consequence of cybernetics is giving rise to a new philosophical era where it's no longer anthropocentric. So humans are no longer the at the center of being. Their individual humans are no longer the epistemic agent of systems of knowledge production. And there's a lot of deconstruction of hierarchies and dualisms and so on. And because of this new philosophical era, and this is also the work of Braidotti, it will say, well, listen, we need to rethink the human, and Catherine Hayles also introduces this. Things have changed to a point where we need to rethink the human, rethink concepts like the body, the human and agency and so on. And I think, it introduces a new kind of knowledge, which is the post-human knowledge, and a new subject of knowledge, which is the post-human subject of knowledge, which is what I'm introducing as the epistemic system, is the sociotechnical system of knowledge production. Whew, that's a handful, isn't it? Do I play the song again to get out? Goodbye. All over the place today, ain't I? Goodbye, guys. Thank you very much.